Alright, so welcome everyone to Unit 6, Similarity, topic number 1, which is going to be about ratios and scale factors. Okay, so the word ratio is going to be really important this unit. Okay, a ratio is a comparison between two or more quantities. Okay, what does this word quantities mean? It means amounts. So I'm comparing two or more different things, right? There's three different ways that we can represent a ratio. We can represent it in words, using a colon, or usually the most common is as a fraction. So in words, we're going to use this the word 2. 4 drinks, 2, 20 snacks. Okay? I've actually written it out. In the colon, I'm going to write 4, and instead of the word 2, I can actually just write 2 dots and say 4 to 20. And then as a fraction, well, we've all been very familiar with fractions, it's going to be 4 over 20, like this. Now, that ratio is different than this ratio that I'm about to write. If I say 4 drinks to 20 snacks, that's different than 20, snacks to 4 drinks. Right? So the order matters when I'm finding ratios. So as a colon, I would put the 20 first, 20 to 4, and then in the fraction, the 20 would now go in the numerator, 20 over 4. Now, when I was talking about the definition of a ratio, I said that it was a comparison. We're going to figure out how are these two numbers compared to each other. So these quantities are related by a specific number, and we call this specific number a scale factor. Okay? So whenever I give you a ratio, in example 1, we've used the ratio that I wrote above, 20 to 4. Okay? How do I find the scale factor between those numbers? How do I find the number that relates these two? We always think about multiplication or multiplying. All right? Every ratio has exactly 2 scale factors. We're going to think about the scale factor that I would multiply the small number to get to the big number and the big number to get to the small number. Okay? When I say the small number, I mean 4 is smaller than 20, right? So 4 is the small number, 20 is the bigger number. So let's follow this arrow. 20 times what, 4 times what gets me 20. I think a lot of us can figure out that that number is going to be 5, but if I'm someone that can't figure that out, if I want to find out 4 times what number gets me to 20, I can actually use division. I can say, well, let me just divide by 4 on both sides and get that that number that I wanted was 5. Okay? So use division to help you figure out what the multiplication is. Let's go the other direction. 20 times what number gets me 4? This one's a little bit harder because I'm saying I'm multiplying to make a number smaller. Like normally I think division when I do that, right? But let's stick with multiplication. 20 times what number is 4? Let's use the method that I just wrote in blue. 20 times some number is going to get me to 4. Well, that means that I can do the division 4 divided by 20 to figure out that number. And 4 divided by 20 is 0.2. Now, I really want to focus in on these two numbers here. Okay? Those two numbers are my scale factor. Those are the numbers that relate 4 to 20 and 20 to 4. Now, the scale factor from small to big was 5. And the scale factor from big to small was 0.2. Whenever I'm going from a smaller number to a bigger number, this scale factor is always going to be greater than 1. I need it to get bigger. Whereas when I go from a big number to a small number, this will always be less than 1, a fraction or a decimal. All right? Let's see what this looks like as a picture. If I'm looking at example 2, it says find the scale factor between each side of the figures below. This is my smaller figure, this is my bigger figure. So this side is, I'm just going to use one side, is 2 units long. And this side here is 6 units long. So if I'm looking at these two numbers, there's one number that I can multiply 2 by to get to 6. Notice I'm going from small to big, so this better be greater than 1. It's 2 times 3. Again, if you didn't know, you could do 6 divided by 2 and get 3 to help you. Okay? In reverse, what if I wanted to go from the big number to the small number? 6 times what gets me to 2? This is getting smaller, it needs to be a fraction. So I can take 2, divide it by 6. When I put that in the calculator though, I get a really crazy decimal, like a decimal that goes on forever. I don't want to round when I'm doing this, so I'm actually just going to use, rather than the decimal, I'm going to use the fraction, okay? So if you get an icky decimal, use the fraction that you've come up with. So I would multiply by 2 over 6. And then I can simplify this, if we would like, by 2. So the scale factor between those is 1/3. From the smaller to the bigger, I've scaled it up by a factor of 3. From the bigger to the smaller, I've scaled it down by 1/3. Okay? See if you can take a moment to find each of these scale factors in part A, B, C, and D. So pause the video for me. Alright, so here are the scale factors that I came up with for parts A, B, C, and D. And what I'll notice is the first example was exactly like the one that we just did, okay, where I had small to big was 3 and big to small was 1/3. The second example, I think some of you might have gotten tripped up right here, okay? I think finding 4.8 might have been a little better. 5 times what gets me to 24, that gets me to 4.8. When I try to find 24 times what gets me to 5, that's a little bit more challenging because when you do the division 5 over 24, you get a really icky decimal. So remember, when I get an icky decimal, leave it as a fraction like this, and that will become your scale factor, okay? I'm hoping that we are okay with C and D, multiply by 4, and then multiply by a fourth or 0.25, all right? Noticing that actually both C and D ended up having the same scale factors, okay? All right, so in parts E and F, we have some units, like a real-world situation that we have. And what I want you to talk about with these is I want to connect this to something you might have learned in 7th grade. So Maggie has $8 for 10 apples. We're still comparing two things. We're comparing money to apples. So I can still make the ratio 10 apples for $8. Okay? Now remember, what we said was that was different than the ratio of $8 to 10 apples. I want to start talking about why this is useful, okay? It's useful because we can actually find out how many apples I can buy for $1 and how many dollars it costs for 1 apple. We call this the unit rate, and we'll use this a little bit when we solve some word problems. All right, so let's get started. If I buy 10 apples for $8, the cost for each apple doesn't change, all right? So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to find the scale factor and do the division 10 divided by 8. When you do 10 divided by 8, that gets you 1.25. So what that means is I can buy 1.25 apples per dollar. It's the scale factor that I would multiply by to get from 8 to 10. Okay? And then similarly, I can do the same thing. I can do the division the other way. I can do 8 divided by 10. 8 divided by 10 is 0.8. So that means I have 80 cents or $0.8 for each apple, which means that's a scale factor I could use to get from apples to dollars. Pause the video now and see if you can set up the two ratios for part F, Abby. 124 shoes to 80 socks, and then what is the other ratio? And then use those ratios and find the unit rates. Find the amount per one shoe and the amount per one sock. Alright, so you should have gotten 1.55 shoes per one sock. And then for the second one, actually you're going to get a really gross decimal. So you don't want to use that decimal and you want to use the original fraction. 80 socks per 124 shoes. Okay? Good luck on the classwork or homework, whatever you're working on, and we will see you in class.